Thank you, Shubha. And we are well on the way. So let's get ready for the first panel. So I'd like to call on stage for the first panel about how science lends solutions. The first panel setting the stage by outlining the shift towards solutions journalism in science, what it is and why it matters. And so may I call on stage LS Shashidhara from NCPS, independent journalist Mahima Jain, Suchita Jha from InNor News, and moderated by Sahana Ghosh. Also, may I use this opportunity to ask anybody in the audience to please either put your phone on silent or in vibration mode, please. If there's any interesting information noise being made, let us not have it from our mobile phones. Thank you. Are we audible? And Mike, this keeps speaking. Yeah. Yeah. Is okay for you, bro? Yeah, now we can hear. Now we can hear this. The speakers in the end. Yeah, we can hear. Okay, that's fantastic. Can you hear me? Thank you. Fantastic. Welcome everybody to the inaugural panel of Science Led Solutions. And as we heard in our what we're going to do in the next 2 days is to tease apart what solutions journalism means and how it is well placed in science journalism as well, and how can we build bridges better between scientists and journalists and communicators, especially in a fragmented world where talking about solutions has also led to a lot of misinformation and misinformation. On that note, I'm going to first bring about a very interesting conversation that I've recently had with a bunch of quantum scientists. What happened was that they were expressing concerns about this hype that has been created around quantum science in India, globally, of course, but in India particularly with the quantum mission, that quantum science is going to solve everything for us. And right now, it's the next technological revolution. And I was speaking to a quantum theorist and somebody who deals with hardware, and they were clearly not very happy with so much of hype. And they did say a bit of hype is absolutely necessary because it sort of brings in funding, a bunch of enthusiastic people to the fore, and it also brings in a lot of energy. But what they were not happy about is that clearly at this point in time, quantum science can't really tackle the real world challenges in the way that we want to, or in the way that we imagine. So on that note, I want to ask a key question for our panelists here is, how do we tell the difference between a solution that actually works or has massive potential and has a lot of evidence that is going to pan out, and a solution that is marketed very well and very sneakily has sort of come into our lives and is sort of creating a lot of buzz and a lot of misinformation as well. So if I could start off with Shashi. First, thank you. Also ask me, you can even tell jokes, but things are already doing that job very well. So, quantum you mentioned, I think we did everything for the years. There's nothing much. That's it. So anyway, no, that's why my voice has a problem. That's why I asked specifically. I'm not clear. Need some amplitude problem. Or maybe I can stand. But until you get me is it this on? Anyway, I'll try it as loud as possible. Yeah, this is working fine. Good. So, when you say solution, the solution has two
it's also relative. We need the proximal solution and ultimate solution to the problem. Now, ultimate solution come when you have an ultimate understanding of the problem itself, right? So, without ultimate understanding of the solution, you cannot have a problem. You cannot have an ultimate solution. Ultimate solution itself is a misnomer. It's more like a sustainable solution, right? Now, agriculture, for example, depending on whatever we knew in biology, particularly after Mendel and Darwin, the plant breeding and genetics, or genetics and plant breeding, provided lots of solution to the food problem. But at the same time, it was not sustainable solution. But with better understanding of chemistry of life, better understanding of climate change, better understanding of ecology, we have somewhere we're thinking that we can actually provide a better sustainable solution. Now that's why we are talking about climate resilient agriculture or climate friendly agriculture and so forth. So as you can see here, you cannot separate the knowledge from solution, because problems are persistently present all the time. Look at before quantum science, where the superconductivity is another area in which there was a lot of hype. Right? People thought that there will be superconducting, devices. Our devices dependent on superconducting material in our pockets as early as in 1960s. But that hype created two things. One is a lot of funding for research in superconductivity, as you already mentioned, that lots of funding will come. More and more students actually came into physics because superconductivity attracted them. But look at, there have been solutions. For example, MRI now. Every small towns have MRI for scanning by many biomedical devices are dependent on some superconducting magnetic material. So in a way, there has been solution, but not necessarily the kind of solution people imagine, right? Because many times when you talk about solution, we think that it solves all the problems of the world and everyone will benefit. But it's not necessarily that would happen. Then the second point about the science and the solution, or the knowledge and the solution, is knowledge is always universal. Knowledge is universal, global, and it's going on for since the beginning of modern civilization, post-agriculture, 12,000 years ago, when the language, through oral communication, we used to disseminate knowledge, but it was a slow process. Then through Gutenberg revolution, we had a much faster and much more reliable source, communication, because it was through written and through images and not oral, because there can be always distortion of information when you communicate orally. And now with modern internet, we can actually do real-time dissemination of knowledge. And that way, knowledge is always global and science is global. There cannot be any different atomic theory or evolutionary theory for Western world versus Eastern world. But solution definitely requires more, local understanding of the problem. For example, the food problem in India could be somewhat different than the food problem elsewhere, or water problem could be somewhere different in India versus elsewhere. So I think when you talk about solutions, it's important that every scientific discovery is, also discussed in the context of solution, because the general public wants solutions. Whereas scientists need to look at only the knowledge that is generated, whether it is factually correct, whether it is applicable globally, whether it is connected to the rest of the knowledge already built over millennia, logically well connected. So those are the kind of critical questions journalists ask. And I'll come to that in one more minute, and then I'll stop the other points later after other panelists speak. When general is about science journalism versus science communication, all of us, want to communicate to general public the kind of work that we do. Not necessarily we do ourselves. We may have a science research communication cell within our own organizations, and we do what called science popularization. There are 2 points. One is simply make sure that general public also aware of the science, and also they understand the kind of science that we do. It also helps us to attract funding, or helps us to attract students or new faculty to our organization. So communication is an important component, but you always communicate something positive, right? But there's no criticism of the kind of work, our self-criticism when we communicate to general public, when we talk about science communication. But science journalism should be combined with criticism. It cannot be simply saying that, oh, India discovered new species of this, or India did this, India did this, India did this. It has to be somewhere with how it stands with global knowledge, what we have added to the knowledge, and where there are certain shortfalls. And when we every time we generate new knowledge, unless it's time tested for a very long time, you still should not call as knowledge. It's still only information, and information always has to be taken with a pinch of salt. That salt should be provided by you. I'll stop here.
So Shashi actually provided the framing for the next question that I had, and that is also on my peers' minds, and I know that. One of the things that we specifically ask in journalism is uh, the right questions, right? When we go to a scientist, we are not just expecting them to help us translate the science into plain language. What we want is that we want them to respond to our questions. And when it comes to solutions, when we are investigating solutions or response to particular challenges, I think these are the questions that really make or break a story. And in terms of the storytelling and framing, I now turn to my peers and I want to pick your brains on this framing. Is there a tension when you approach a story that is solutions driven? I know a bunch of you've worked on a lot of solutions reporting, right? Basically, again, to reiterate, solutions journalism is about investigating a response to a particular problem or a challenge and showing where the evidence lies. But I was curious, have you also quizzed the researchers about the failures also? Or did the failures sort of become stepping stones to actually coming up or landing to a better solution? Has that happened with you both?
Shahana, this is like something recently that I experienced. I was talking to a scientist in the Rice University, and he has pioneered some biodegradable material from bacterial cellulose. So the questions that of course, it is a good breakthrough story. I was just wondering how scalable the solution was. And when I posed those questions to them, since bioplastics have existed for a long time, but the conditions under which they disintegrate or the scalability, the cost production, those are still massive and they're not gaining the popularity they should have by now. So those are the questions that I posed to them and he stopped responding. So I was hoping for a solution story. I was hoping for something that is scalable, but then that story fell through. So the very core that makes a solution story is how deeply rooted it is in the community, how real world the solution is. So even it doesn't have to come from big bodies, it doesn't have to come only from scientists, but even the existing science, how it is being utilized. So we did a story recently. I mean, it's very popular even in India. The drying of fruits and vegetables to, curb food loss. So that has just been expedited with the help of solar dryers. Those are very simple, but they have a great impact on the community, and they are also preventing emissions, also helping in preventing emissions. So those kind of stories that are led by communities that maybe do not require a massive investment, but are still rooted in science. So food drying has existed for the longest time, but solar dryers have expedited the process. So stuff like that, where community is at the core of the story, is what makes a solution story. So we definitely work on evidence based stories, but at the same time we highlight the limitations, which is like my most favorite part, even as a journalist, because we know where to ask the
But are scientists also opening up to talking about limitations? Shashi did mention that, of course, knowledge is for all, right? And we, as purveyors of information, also have a responsibility to talk about the limitations, and I think that makes a fantastic solutions story. So, do scientists open up about limitations?
They did. So
because that's buried at the end of the papers usually.
Yeah, so the response is mixed sometimes. So like the other scientist, he did not, but there have been scientists who have. Yes.
Just to add a point, it's also important to talk about the potential. There is a difference between the extrapolation and the imagination, right? Very often, general public imagine quite a bit without understanding the science behind this. So that's where the problem comes. They expect solutions which are very imaginary very often. Whereas we can actually extrapolate. We do always science. Right? We keep on building new hypotheses based on the prior hypothesis. Nothing but some extrapolation. Right? Even the potential solutions is an extrapolation. Right? We can say perhaps this may happen if you do this. But there will be 10 obstacles to go to that level, but it is still a reliable potential. Right? So nothing wrong in doing a little bit of extrapolation when you think about solution. In my own work, for example, in 2001, we published a research where we showed that a small fruit fly insect, Drosophila, can be used to study human genes directly. Human study diseases, you can make disease models of flies. We can also use Drosophila for drug screening, right, to identify new drugs. But the way general newspaper, published that work is like, as if Drosophila is going to solve all the problems of biomedical research in the country, which is low cost. But at the same time, it was only a potential. It took another 20 years to actually Drosophila models of the diseases. Even today, we have not developed any new drugs using fly as a model system for screening. But we can actually do some of the initial hypotheses using flies. But now perhaps other model like zebrafish, the vertebrate model has come out where you can actually do drug screening with a small model organism compared to mouse.
This is just to kind of add to what they there is this is something I learned last year, which was the technology readiness levels, which NASA developed in 1970s. And I'm sure scientists are more familiar with it, but journalists, it felt like were not, or are not. And I think that once you, as journalists, when we place innovation, discovery, or breakthrough on the level at which it is at, whether it is the knowledge level, which is universal, which is 0, and then in society, which would be 9, it kind of answers or brings up a lot of questions in our stories. What this also taught me, this was mainly this was at the labs at the Novo Nordisk Foundation CO2 Research Center, and they were doing carbon capture and storage research. And they repeatedly kind of pointed out which innovations were at 1, 2, or 3, and they would routinely use this in their communication with us. And that's when I felt like this is what we need to tell the public, that we are at 2 with this or 3 with this, maybe not use those exact words, but find more creative ways of saying it. Because once we get there, our discussions with scientists also become less confrontational and accusatory, that this didn't work and why didn't this at work, because the scientists never presented it as a silver bullet. We took it as that and we put it in the headlines. So there is a miscommunication there. And I feel like once you use the PRL to write about an innovation, it helps in breaking that down. And the 2 questions I've begun to constantly ask the scientists is, where is this solution on the readiness level? And what conditions do you need for this to be in society at a scalable stage? And this also throws up an interesting problem, because it shows us that this is not a linear journey. There is a lot of back and forth between lab and society, and there might be solutions which are great at the lab level but don't translate well into society. So there is a lot that we need to work with as the readiness levels increase, and this could be with the industry, with funding, with other kind of research. So brought up climate smart agriculture, and there is a lot of technology out there. And in my recent story from Wangabe, what I found was women rice farmers, for example, are unable to use this technology primarily because of the age-old issues of them not having land rights or access to finance. So we have great technology; it's ready to be deployed. It can, help reduce drudgery and cut down emissions. But we cannot deploy it at the scale we would love to, primarily because we haven't solved the basic societal problems there. So I think there is a lot of back and forth when we're talking about solutions, and I think interesting solution story are also at where these intersections happen. Again, would you also think that a process or the process of science, right, in itself is also a great solution story to tell? If I can ask everybody.
Sort of yes and no. The reason is the process of science, the way we understand and the way we practice, it's somewhat very intricate, and then because we are committed to certain levels of with the intensity of how we practice science, passion. At the same time, I'm sure there will be a session on ethics and integrity, and when we are committed to practice with high levels of ethics and integrity in science, we are expected to be very patient in communicating what we want to communicate, and also how much we communicate, how much we extrapolate, right? But when you say general public, if you keep on telling them the same story, it may not become a story. There's no news there very often, right? The incremental improvement in the knowledge or incremental expansion of the knowledge may not be a big story for them, right? So obviously, you need to tell them what is the big story there. That's the joy of the journalism. With the with a practical note saying that you know this this has come out after about, let's say, 30, 40 years of research involving 30 to 40,000 people from across the globe, and perhaps the last mile connection may have come from an Indian lab or some lab which you are covering, and then say, but the solution, which is while good solution may come out, there could be a short term, medium term, and long term solution at very different time points. That also requires time and continuous support. That's that practical knowledge has to come. We can't be keep telling them about practice of science in great detail is not going to make story.
Worthiness aspect. How do you pick a good solution story, or how do you know it's going to be a good solutions story? It's just not about creating hope or the imagination of it all, but also it has strong evidence. How do you then judge that, and how do you pick a good solution story that's rooted in science and evidence? So, in my work, I generally work at the intersection of science and society, less so with labs. And I report on environment, health, and gender. And I think, like, when solutions are in society, something very interesting happens, and there is a lot of conflict, cohesion. Questions of cohesion come up. There is the question of why should we do this, and why can't someone else do it? Where does the money come from? Those kind of questions come up, and I think that's where we can really look at how the solution fits into a system, and whether that systemic change is possible. Because a solution by itself, when I look at a story, is, it's great, but it doesn't make for a great story. I feel for me, it works when there is nuance, there is enough evidence, and there is a possibility of moving a system along the direction that we want it to move. Right. So, Mahima said, it is based on evidence and how well the solution is performing. But at the same time, when I have to figure out ideas, maybe there have been times when I have revisited my old stories where communities had been facing problems, and if there is an innovative solution that they came up with, And there have been cases. So how did they come up with that solution? There was a parking problem in my own city, and some residents, they just decided, rent a common ground and make that their parking spot. So although they had to shell out money, but then it made their life so much easier. So it is not exactly a science story, but sometimes the community-led solutions, they go a long way. So what might be also I try not to differentiate between big and small scale solutions. So what might be big or small is objective. So if it is if a solution is small for a community, maybe it has a wider impact on somebody else. So the need is to put the story out there so that it can be replicated elsewhere. So which is where the insight pillar of solutions journalism comes. So for me, yes, revisiting old ideas has been like a gold mine. Yeah. Yes.
I think it's a very critical point about, although I mentioned process of science, not necessarily creating. I think evidence-based solution, evidence-based generation of knowledge, and the way the science practices. Right? Science is not about physics, chemistry, math. It's the methods of how the knowledge is produced, which is evidence-based. Right? Use all kinds of analytical methods, but you generate evidence, observation, or experiment. Something where journalists have to talk about process of science is that evidence for everything, right? And that has to be mentioned in every story that you write, because the solution is directly dependent on the evidence. If there is no evidence, and you cannot come out with a solution. For example, there are some ways knowledge also be sort of generated as an hypothesis, and a very good hypothesis is also considered as a piece of knowledge, at least in the scientific community, to be tested. We may not have the ability to test right now, but it's still a piece of knowledge. Like, for example, the Large Hadron Collider work took about 30 years, but the theory behind this was already known. It was established theory, and then people almost knew that it's going to be confirmed, although we cannot say it's confirmed unless it's confirmed, right? But there is also a problem in the society right now, at least in the Indian context, that a lot of things we say that Indians already knew, and we don't need to discover anything new, and already textbooks are being changed. Initially, we thought that only biology is being targeted, evolution was dropped, and many things were being done. But today I heard that only 2 days ago that mathematics textbook is changed, physics textbook is changed. That's going to be extremely damaging for the society in future if we don't have well learned students in physics or mathematics or in biology or chemistry. It's going to affect the solution science later. We'll not be able to provide simple solutions to even provide basic needs of the society. If we don't teach them, for example, in biology, if you don't teach them genetics and evolution, you will never be able to do good agriculture biology. Right? So I think that has to be communicated well. Right. The practice of science and process of science.
Fabulous. And this is the question that I was just going to ask. There's a lot of pressure also on sort of unifying traditional knowledge or wisdom and a modern science, or the blend between the two. Where do you, Shashi, find yourself between the two?
I mean, like in society, there's so-called separation of the expertise and skills and activities. I mean, there's nothing wrong. For example, I say my job is to generate new knowledge. That's being able to do it. I don't know how it can be converted to a solution, but there are other people who will do it. There are, for example, in science, we call some are basic scientists, some are applied, and some are translational. So if I'm a basic science person, I can say I've generated this knowledge. Were you to ask an applied or a translational scientist? So that's why in the writing a story as a journalist, right? If I want to communicate my work to the public through directly myself or with the help of my colleagues who are professional science communicators, I mean, I can only communicate the knowledge that is generated and what went behind this generation of knowledge. But if you want to identify the solution for this, I need to bring in a professional applied or translation biologist and say, how do you think this knowledge can be converted to a real life solution or solution to a real life problem? And when you do the story as a journalist, you can bring in those people rather than asking me how this will solve the societal problem. You can bring in another expert, real expert, and then can ask them, right? How you convert into a product. I think the next one of the sessions, even Taslim is going to be here.
Right.
He's the best person to tell us, what could be the solution, what's the timeline for the solution.
Right. So on that note, we will also slightly look at nuance before we go into audience Q&A. Suchita and Mahima, we've spoken about nuance earlier as well, and as Shashi mentioned, we also do our own peer reviews in journalism, and that's actually where science journalism, makes a difference, and that's a key difference again in science communication and journalism as well. So, in terms of nuance, and especially when you talk of traditional knowledge and modern science or the lab-based science, do you also find a bit of tension, or how do you bring about that nuance as well in solution stories? And after this, we are going to go to audience questions. So please put your thinking caps on. We have three fabulous panelists ready to answer your questions. To quickly just briefly say, um, the traditional knowledge bit is there, but there is also that a solution is perfectly important and scientific, and yet it might be resisted by society. That is, I think, there are two things here. As I said, you have to, in some sense, show the process of science as much as possible and carry the audience along over time. So when it gets to the deployment stage, when it's in society, people understand what it means and what choices they are making. But no solution in that sense can, I mean, once it's out there, I think it can't be limited to just something perfect. Like, it's not going to be that silver bullet. We all know solar is important, and then what kind of solar? Who gets to put it? Do we need the large thing? So I think that's where, like, a lot of resistance debates come up, and having open dialogue and including as many sections of the society as possible, giving them the voices to voice their concerns is important, because it cannot be like top down all the time. We know what's better for you, do it. I think that's where a lot of resistance comes up from society. So yeah, there have been cases where traditional knowledge has provided solutions. We have all seen that. And sometimes it has also been seen, like I was doing a story on forest rights, and the community that had gotten forest rights, they started growing their, age old vegetables and herbs and everything, tubers and stuff, which had been eradicated because of the forest management policies. So once those herbs and everything became back, the groundwater level started improving, the soil quality started improving. So here, what we saw was that modernism, the modern practices of forest management versus traditional practices of forest management, they were completely at odds with each other. And when the communities took over and they took over the forest practices, they got better results because their focus was not just on the trees but on like all the kinds of plants and herbs that we have. So yes, there are nuances, and India is kind of a lasagna where everything is interrelated, and you cannot have one layer without the other. So, or a ratatouille, as Ganesh like a ratatouille, yes. So yes, like Mahima also said that we cannot, the solution cannot be top down. We have to integrate them with what they already know, and has it been time tested. And sometimes the science catches up a little later what the tradition has already been doing. It has been seen. I'm not advocating myths here, but solutions that they have been practicing, and later on it was discovered, okay, this was very simple. So it's a very fine line also. It's a very fine line to tread, yes. Difficult job here, right? So where we don't sort of our narratives don't devolve into perpetrating pseudoscience and misinformation as well. And on that note, we did hear panelists sort of tease apart what solutions, science solutions, might look like and look like right now, and what might not they actually do for us. I wonder if anybody wants to ask questions. Yes, Uma, please.
can switch back those mics, right? Yeah. This is more of a comment. Ideas of how solutions are, and what you brought up, Mahima, about the social context. I mean, this is also something really something people have considered for a very long time. A solution, as advocated by a scientist, cannot immediately be integrated into society. I would also like to point out that is not the job of the scientist. So it's a bit unfair to expect scientists to come with society relevant and integratable solutions. I think the job of the scientist is, as Shashi was saying, usually, blue sky, frontier, innovation. And I think that is separate from the practical integration into society. And in fact, even these things like TLRs, as scientists, we are often asked in grant proposals and so on, and we don't even know what it is. So I think that there's a real disconnect between, the imaginations or the, kind of mental space of scientists and the suggestion that something is a solution on the ground. So I think that that's important to portray to the public, because the public should not believe that scientists are here to provide solutions. Scientists are doing science and pushing frontiers. There's many gaps in it in terms of solutions. Just maybe that's like preaching to the choir, but I think it's important to make that distinction to the public as well.
My question is very simple. We have a solution by a science has adoption by the society might not be accepted by us. So how do we, as scientists or as journalists, look at it? The example that I would like to give is the in vitro fertilization technology that started, but now it has been so extensively adopted by the society that even small towns in India have IVF clinics. But then the use of that technology is, I have a doubt that it is not always manipulated, because a lot of gender biased issues are coming up there. So how do we, as scientists or as journalists, respond?
No. So I think you're touching upon slightly different aspect of the society. So every scientific discovery may lead to some new technology. As Uma mentioned, there's another domain. There are technologists or translation scientists. They may come out with some new product, new technology, new utilization of how science can be used. The problem is when you take it to the market, when you take it to the public, it is a market route. Because irrespective of how much we talk about social good and social equity, in a large, diverse country like ours, the final reach is only market driven, right? One small margin of profit will drive the dissemination of the technology to the grassroots level. That's where the problem is. The problem is nothing to do with science, nothing to do with us. It is how the market is operating. It's completely corrupt. The IVF is the best example of how a simple knowledge which could have been used in a very judicious way, only in certain cases, has been misused so much left and right. And as you said, when small villages have IVF centers these days, and it is actually creating more health problems, more social other problems. As you said, gender inequity is increasing because of this. It's creating a problem. But that's unfortunately is the misuse of science. It's like misuse of science for defense, right? Today, for example, drones we thought is going to change our agriculture. Now people are going to bring back a new government is thinking of new regulation on drones that people cannot own drones, cannot be used this. There are so many permits you have to get. Now it's as if taking a license for a gun, you have to take license for the drones, right? It would have used for a variety of social problems like traffic, agriculture, water, and everything. Now drones is being more used for defense purposes. Now it's become a defense property. So this is the problem of the society, which I don't know. I'm not a competent to address this problem. You need.
Get up. These mics up.
Get up and speak.
there was a point that was discussed that a solution may be resisted by society. I think that one of the factors that we address is, or have more people talk about this, is that use of different languages for promoting that particular story, solution stories. These languages people would be more comfortable with. They would be able to relate to the story more because it is in their language. So, what would be some initiatives that can increase the accessibility of the story in terms of having the story in different languages? And I'm not just talking about the plain literal translations, but translations that are empathetic, that are relatable to the general public, so that some other community can adopt that particular solution. Like you said.
Yes, accessibility and the top-down approach has always been, not always. It has been seen not to work a lot of times because there is resistance. And here, I think it is more about breaking through to the community and not just a language barrier. So language barriers exist, yes, but here I think it is more about integrating the community together while presenting the solution and not telling them this is how you should do it. Maybe this is something that we know and would you like to try it. So the way that you take a solution to somebody is also a very big challenge, because as this is something I think in all fields we face, that if you go and lecture somebody, they are bound to resist. So you have to involve them in the process itself. And yes, like you added, not literal translations, but yes, translations. And also it's not necessary that if a solution has taken place, say in Maharashtra, it only has to be translated in Marathi. It can be scaled up, and that is where I think English hits the sweet spot, because it is accessible in I think all states, most of the states, and those journalists, of course, can take it forward. So I think yours was a two-part question. So yes, how to involve the community in the solution and the language thing should go together.
Particular sections of this. Sorry, but that is true for all languages.
Right, and it is there's what do you do? How do you deal with that? We have such a variety, so many languages in India, so many groups, and there are also people who do not know how to read and write. So that is a type of scalability. Maybe we can talk about that.
I also have a point on this to your question. A lot of the disease surveillance, for example, that's being done with communities, right? They are also pretty community specific. For example, if you go to Northeast, it looks at their interests, it looks at their issues, and that's how these surveillance are being designed now. If you go to the Western Ghats, again, the model is different. So I think reporting on those different models itself, whether it's in English or in the language of that particular state or region, is a great way to also solve this problem.
My question is that do you think it's for Professor Shashidhara that you talked about various aspects of the science like basic science, then comes applied sciences. So do you think that science journalism can decrease the importance of basic science as because journalists are looking for big stories that are she shared a story about bioplastics, but because of the limitation you thought that the story is not good enough to sell. So, do you think that journalism, science journalism, can decrease the importance of basic science? What are your thoughts about it?
So, and I think basic science is what basically generating new knowledge, right? And knowledge dissemination is the most important aspect of communication, right? I told you, right? Without knowledge dissemination, you don't have come out with so many solutions across the globe, right? Knowledge being disseminated since we acquired, evolutionarily acquired, not through some other means. Our ability to communicate using syntactic language, and now we are using variety of different tools to communicate. And journalists are the professionals who understand the knowledge, but also understand how to communicate to the general public. For example, I may be generating knowledge, but I don't know how to communicate to a general public. So, but we have to first disseminate knowledge before trying to say what this knowledge will produce. So rather than saying that we have some discovery from such and such a group, which will lead to some new, let's say anti-Alzheimer's drug, that will not become a news. That will not become knowledge. That's not even a fact, right? So it's simply saying that will not become a news. We have to first say what is the discovery, what is the knowledge that is generated, how it may be useful for finding a solution. That knowledge has to be disseminated first, because people should understand that creation of new knowledge, understanding the deeper and deeper the insight, getting insight into the natural ecosystem or natural world is the most important, activity of civilization. And then only you think of solution.
So, okay, there are two things here to keep in mind. One is a breakthrough story, and one is a solution story. They are two different stories. So, breakthrough story is like a news story that this new discovery has been made and the potential it presents. So, that is obviously we will cover that as journalists. The particular example I was giving you was because it did not suit the kind of solution story I was looking for. Doesn't mean it is not a story. But if it is applicable outside the laboratory, that is where the solution story aspect comes in. Because as journalists, we have to talk with accountability that, okay, this was the breakthrough, but 20 years later, it is a solution. So solution story might not happen immediately as, along with the breakthrough, you might have to wait for it. So that is what I just wanted to differentiate, that breakthroughs and solution stories take time.
We have time for just one last question.
Hi, yeah, it was very interesting discussion. So it's very clear from all of this that there's a lot of journalistic pressure to convert a scientific story into a very simple narrative so that it doesn't come out as a fix, a technological fix for complex societal problems. And I think this panel or this conference is to create that bridge so that it doesn't come about as that. So my question to the journalist, because I come from the science world, is what is your current process of, identifying, are there any inherent trade-offs, are there any ethical considerations, what are the limitations? What is your current process so that we as scientists can then try to address them and have a more, have a more fulfilling conversation so that you can convert our basic science story or a technology story into something that has a journalistic future.
Well, I work backwards. Like I do field reporting and then find what is being fixed and see how it's being fixed. But there is also a way to do it the other way around, which is to find the problem. And I mean, I work at that stage where what next? Like if there is a lot of heat, hour after hour we report on heat. So what are we doing about it? So then comes the heat action plans and what are the other fixes and things like that. But to answer your question and to just kind of respond to Uma ma'am, I wasn't saying that the scientist has to convey this to the public. I think it's just the journalist's job to find where that particular thing is at and make it relevant to their audience. So I think even fundamental sciences need to be consistently talked about if they are going to at some point be of relevance to society at a large scale. So
yeah, I just want to add a request rather to all the journalists here that a lot of interesting, very good quality science is being done in smaller universities and colleges too, particularly in biology, for example, evolution biology, ecology work. A lot of interesting work is being done outside the metro cities. They don't need big equipment. They don't need a lot of research funding. I think that science also should be communicated. Otherwise, they will not get motivation. They'll also, more future support will come when their stories are also covered. Please do that.
That's interesting because in my last story, as a rice farmer turned scientist was my key source, and it was just an amazing story because she was the character and the solver of the problem. I think those are really the best stories, and she was from Sakleshpur in Karnataka, so that's a really small place. So I completely agree, move away from the cities and look at the smaller labs and what's being done there. So, just to end the discussion here, and I'll also add to add a point to what they were saying is in science journalism specifically, we look at the question of relevance when we look at a science paper or when we talk to a scientist. Why now? That's a very important question to us. The other point is. So what? There's a so what question that we ask. You've done this work and you're saying so and it can do so and so potentially. So what? Right? So that's a big question to ask. And I think when you sort of tease apart and break it down, then it becomes clear whether this is a story that we would like to pick or not. And it doesn't mean that your science is not important. It's just that the newsworthiness is also what drives us. The newsworthiness is what keeps us in business, and the business of journalism, like the business of science, as you know, is also under tremendous pressure. So, on that note, I would love to end this panel and continue our discussions for the next 2 days. What we saw here is that we need more nuance, or we need to build more bridges, of course, but the bridge building also means that we don't overstep on each other's toes. We also come really hard at scientists, and we need to ask the right and hard questions as well, and not just the very basic questions. What does this mean? Can you translate it in plain language? The process of science, the process of discovery is equally enriching and equally important. But again, we need to do our storytelling around it a bit better, perhaps. Basic sciences are, of course, extremely important. We're not going to go anywhere without basic sciences, right? We tend to pick up stories that are more towards the applied sciences. But I think there are stories in the labs all around us. The stories about why these people are doing certain things, and journalists are right here to connect those dots to society as well when the time comes. So thank you all for being a very patient audience, and we'll move on to the next panel discussion, which is again an equally important topic when we talk of solutions journalism. Thank you so much. A big round of applause for our panelists.
Thank you, Sohana. Yes, thank you to the inaugural panel. And as someone who faced a very tough Viva Voce at Madurai Kamaraj University, come on, bring on the tough questions. Let's go. Scientists are ready to answer it. Now, before we go to the next panel, we do have a small break for tea and coffee.